Hello. Ooh. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to take a second to look around since this is the largest crowd I've ever had in my years at the teach-in, so thank you all for choosing to be in community with me today. And thank you to the Ignatian Solidarity Network for always inviting me to be a part of this space. Even before I wrote a book and everyone knew who I was invited into this space to think about liberation and justice in really beautiful ways. And I just love being able to engage with so many students from across the country. So thank you all for being here with me. Also, I'm a millennial, so I will be awkwardly reading from my phone, so bear with me if I lose my place. So I want to begin by naming my sisters and brothers in the Haitian struggle. The Biden administration has deported 20,000 Haitians since his inauguration. Haiti for years has been undergoing political turmoil, police violence, the assault of protesters, political assassinations. I want to ground today's talk, my call to action for the church and all Catholics who care about liberation, in the history and the resistance, the revolutionary spirit of the Haitian people. And I encourage you all to follow and learn from Woy magazine, which is a newsletter and media project founded and written by Haitians. My work is aimed at helping everyone who encounters it, from whatever your lived experience might be, to think and act on a commitment to helping all persons thrive. My work is grounded in the belief that everyone deserves to have their needs met, that every person is worthy of dignity and flourishing in our society and in our world. My Catholic faith demands that I name and confront white supremacy and the role Christianity has played in sustaining it, especially as we see growing efforts that continue to deprive already marginalized people of their autonomy. By acknowledging this relationship, and by further understanding how imperialism and colonialism have shaped our world, we can begin to transform our church, our country, and our world. This is especially important at this moment in history. This year, we've seen Moroccan migrants who died at the border with Spain. We see Black migrants who have died in trailers at the US border and in Mexico. Haitian migrants who continue to be abused at the hands of the state and who continue to be disregarded and erased from Catholic media conversations about migration. Our Catholic faith demands that we name these various tragedies and work to eliminate oppressive systems that destroy our world's most marginalized, the very systems that lead to these crises that we are seeing worldwide. For me, in order to understand how to do this work, and in order to understand the role my faith plays in this, in order to maintain the hope and courage to keep doing this work, it begins with abolition. Abolition Feminism Now is a book by Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica R. Miners, and Beth E. Ritchie. In this book, they write that abolition is both a mode of analysis and a political practice. They add, abolition feminism has always been a politics, the refusal to co-sign humans and other beings to disposability, inseparable from practice. How can one use an abolitionist framework to think more critically about our faith? How can this abolitionist framework help us as Catholics to hope amid so much collective death? And how can this framework challenge us as Catholics, as believers of Christ who are called to respond at this moment in our church and nation's history? I've been sitting with these questions for some time now. These questions and what it means to think about abolitionist Catholics continue to be at the heart of my own work and commitment to justice, resistance, and liberation. Yet this is not easy work, and these questions do not have easy answers. This work is not meant to be simple or stagnant. This work is not meant to be done alone. As Davis and Co. write in Abolition Feminism, this work is never a solo project. Individuals tire, fade, movements deepen and continue. Sometimes the group is only a few folks working together in a church basement, but these gatherings, networks, and ad hoc or formal groups create insurgent sites of political education that build relationships, share language, strategy, tools, and analysis. And these spaces create openings for people to learn and to practice. What tools are available to hold someone accountable if we don't call the police? Collectivism is a thorough line across generations, peoples, and mobilizations. undervalued and unrecognized, but key to freedom making. This understanding has been crucial to my own work, organizing, and writing. I'm from New York City, and we have very deeply felt the impact of a pandemic that has killed more than 1 million Americans. In my hometown, more than 69,000 people have lost their lives. Thousands have lost health insurance, jobs, savings, and their homes. And it has disproportionately affected Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color, communities which still continue to face violence at the hands of armed police officers. As I was processing these tragedies while also working on Birth of a Movement, my father got COVID, my partner's father got COVID, and many of our friends lost relatives, jobs, and amid all that, cops were still shooting Black Americans. Violence against trans women and men was still rising, and gentrifiers were still heading into our Bronx neighborhoods. I began to sit with what it means to exist and survive in a state of constant anxiety, how that anxiety becomes a state of constant surveillance, how that constant state of self-surveillance, already compounded by state violence and surveillance, impacts every part of my life, including my relationship to God. Amid so much death, I struggled to find hope. Ooh, sorry, I told you guys I was gonna lose my place, and I did. All right. So amid so much collective death, I really struggled to find hope. I struggled to pray. I struggled to even believe if this work was worth doing. And I didn't really emerge from that space until I attended the Black Catholic Theological Symposium in the fall of last year. The gathering took place at Notre Dame, and it included Black scholars, theologians, and clergy. And it was here where I met individuals like Dr. Valerie D. Lewis-Mosley, a brilliant pastoral theologian, activist, and professor. If you aren't familiar with her work, I recommend you go and read her essay, My Unbridled Tongue Challenges Inequities That Threaten Black Women's Lives, which she wrote in July of 2020. During my time at Notre Dame, I listened to Valerie talk to younger activists, including high school and college students. She reminded them of the importance of caring for one's body. She emphasized the need to bring our healthy, whole selves to whatever advocacy work we do as Catholics. And this was health rooted in loving and caring for oneself. She described the love and hope in Jesus' ministry, the power and love of Christ on the cross, and she challenged me. She challenged how I think about abolition and the Catholic faith. She helped me to begin to understand that an abolitionist framework, if applied to our daily lives, demanded that we imagine and hope for and strive outside of the tragedies around us, and not by further breaking ourselves, but by relying on our communities. Community building was a way to build and create systems outside of the ones around us, systems outside of the violence of our world. It took me months to fully realize how pivotal that moment was for my own life. Valerie inspired me and revitalized my commitment to my own vocation, to my faith, to liberation. I witnessed an intergenerational moment in which she shared her wisdom with someone younger than us both. And that reminded me of the power of sharing knowledge, the power of telling stories, the power of being in community, the power of dreaming and building, the power of abolition as practice in my faith and life. She pointed me back to why I began reporting on the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, why I wrote the book in 2020, why I write and speak about it today. It is a movement that taught an entire generation how to imagine, fight for, and build a world that refuses to co-sign human beings and other beings to disposability. In 2013, following the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the killing of Trayvon Martin, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi created the Black Lives Matter movement. At the time, it was mostly an online campaign on Twitter and Facebook to help empower organizers, especially younger ones, by providing them with the tools and resources to think about and fight for racial justice. The founders, in the summer of 2014, along with more than 400 organizers from all across the country, traveled to Ferguson, Missouri. This was shortly after Michael Brown Jr. was killed. These organizers, a majority of whom were women and men in the LGBTQ community, helped to support the marchers who were facing daily violence from law enforcement. Since its birth almost 10 years ago, this movement has grown to include chapters all across the country, providing resources on restorative justice, abolition, and conflict resolution. It is a movement centered around inclusion, affirming and centering the experiences of Black, queer, and trans women and men, and working toward a world where all Black people are liberated and free. The movement taught me how to respond to the world around me. It taught me to pay attention to the most marginalized voices in our nation, how to uplift these voices while also learning from them as a writer. By teaching me how to uplift these communities, I began to learn how white supremacy conditions us to erase these experiences, how it disempowers Blackness, how it conditions us to believe that we are not enough without whiteness. I began to understand how patriarchal white power moves in every institution in America, including our church. I was learning about privilege while also coming of age on Twitter, like a true millennial. And I was existing in spaces where I was accepting my own Blackness while also understanding how this same oppressed body was privileged. How this privilege allows me to move in spaces and with power not afforded to darker-skinned women. Through the online hashtag, I was introduced to social critics outside the movement who embodied the tenets of the founders and who helped me to think more deeply about why and how this movement was born. This includes thinkers like Zahida Kelly, Zoe Zadmudzi, Dwayne David Paul, and William C. Anderson. These thinkers were, like the founders and organizations of the BLM movement, using social media to help other followers think more deeply about Blackness, abolition, sexuality, colorism, and capitalism. The more I internalized the mission of these women and organizers around the movement, the more I began to challenge the whiteness of American Catholicism, both internally and externally. In 2014 and 2015, I started attending protests and interviewing activists. I began talking with other Black Catholics about what this movement meant and how it could challenge our church's leadership to commit itself more fully to our communities. We talked about the role this movement was playing and how we understood and responded to the signs of the times, how it challenged our conscientiousness and our relationship to Catholicism. I was born in the Dominican Republic, a Black Catholic country in the Caribbean that shares an island with another Black Catholic country. Yet I did not acknowledge my own Black Catholic identity, my family, and my own nation's history and ties to Haiti until my mid-20s when I began reporting on this movement. And it was through this reporting that I began to unlearn and begin to truly understand my own Black, immigrant, Caribbean Catholic identity, one that was extremely privileged and also oppressed, one that was radically and refreshingly different from the whiteness of mainstream American Catholicism. This movement helped me to begin to ask questions internally, while also presenting how these questions and themes were shaping the stories I was writing. It forced me to begin to decolonize my Christianity, to begin to imagine my faith outside of the colonialist violence that introduced the faith to my homeland. And most importantly, how to center voices who were not getting centered in our church or in our media. These movements taught me how to be Catholic, how to be a Catholic writer, how to live out what Pope Francis was preaching. He constantly calls on us to understand how consumerism under capitalism and systemic oppression are related, how both intersect with white supremacy and vice versa. He calls us to, and I quote, to get to know people, listen, expand the circle of ideas, end quote. Being open in the ways God is moving us and calling us to respond to the world around us means that we are, Francis preaches, to find the courage to leave the confines of our own security and comfort, to become bruised, hurting, and dirty as we joyfully approach the suffering other in a spirit of solidarity. For white people committed to authentic, radical anti-racism work, solidarity must include a dialogue around power, who has it and who does not. This means acknowledging and working to relinquish this power. This means recognizing and thinking and talking about white privilege, how white supremacy and racial capitalism have benefited you while simultaneously exploiting and killing communities of color, and how these privileges are present in daily, seemingly mundane interactions, including those that occur in our academic, religious, and media spaces. If you truly care about solidarity, if you truly care about Black lives, about creating a more inclusive church and nation, about faith-based advocacy, then it means asking yourselves, what am I willing to give up to truly center and uplift marginalized women, children, and men? How am I willing to imagine and fight for a freer, more liberated church and world? How am I going to demand that whatever Catholic space I occupy uplift Black people? Being concerned with anti-racism work for me as a Black immigrant Catholic means being concerned with anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist work. It means embracing and applying an abolitionist feminist framework to my work and faith. And it means allowing myself to be educated and politicized by Black and brown queer organizers who are the leaders and experts in this work. In recent years, we have seen white Catholics engaging with this movement, and many were actively and consistently raising funds for organizers and mutual aid campaigns. Many were also using their various platforms to urge fellow white Catholics to support people of color being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Many hosted Zoom book clubs and webinars where they discussed many of the topics and themes I've mentioned here tonight. Many wrote letters to their bishops, many called out their white priests, many listened and learned from women and men of color. All of these efforts are important and they must continue, but they are not enough, and white Catholics, both lay and clergy, cannot get complacent. We must continue to confront our history. We must understand how we as a church have been shaped by the very colonialist sentiments that guided the early church and the so-called founders of this country. How those sentiments connect to the white rage and violence we saw at the Capitol, and how that anger and hate relates to the inability of our church leaders to collectively engage with any movement that is not led by white men. We must demand that those writing and telling Catholic stories stop centering whiteness, white Catholics, and include this history and nuance when we talk about the church. The United States has always encouraged white rage and violence. European colonizers, angered by the treatment they received in their homelands, arrived on Turtle Island and violently stormed and pillaged lands that were not theirs. Colonizers destroyed and attempted to erase indigenous history. Colonizers raped and murdered indigenous communities. This is genocide. The colonizers also kidnapped, forcibly transported, and sold enslaved African women, men, and children. The creation of new technology at the turn of the 20th century meant more reformed, sanitized systemic violence against citizens of color. Segregation, voting restrictions, redlining, prisons, detention centers. The United States of America has the highest number of incarcerated people, and our inequitable healthcare system has contributed to the death of thousands of Americans. White colonialist violence is how my people became Catholic. This is Catholic history, a part of our faith that cannot be ignored. There can be no reckoning and no path forward for our church until our leaders, our media, and all Catholic spaces and institutions begin to repair the harm our church has caused and continues to cause Catholics of color. I want to challenge white people inside and outside of our church to engage with abolitionist work, including organizers and thinkers who are inviting us to learn from the multiple ways ordinary people try to respond to interpersonal harm, particularly gender and sexual violence, without resorting to police and prisons. Some questions white allies can ask themselves, and all people who are committed to being allies in this work. Some questions to consider. How can white Catholics think about strategic ways to work and struggle toward liberation? What are some examples in history that we can turn to? How white is the space that I work in? If I'm part of a Catholic organization or group, whether a religious order, a school, a magazine, or a newspaper, how many people of color are allowed into that space? I want white Catholics to confront their privilege and think about how they have been and currently are complicit in systemic oppression. And I want this to inform how you relate and uplift the pro-life issues that matter to Black, Indigenous, POC communities. Black and brown mothers continue to receive inadequate medical care in the US. From primary care physicians who deny their pain to higher maternal mortality rates. Suicide remains one of the leading causes of death for Indigenous youth. Black migrants continue to be abused in government cages. Anti-Asian sentiment remains on the rise, with more than 11,000 hate incidents against the Asian American community reported between March of 2020 and March of 2022. Americans of color also face higher rates of anxiety, depression, and are more likely to suffer a heart attack or stroke. US Black, transgender, and non-conforming people face some of the highest forms of violence in this country. White people in our church need to hear this and understand that along with the various tragedies that threaten our livelihood, we are also suffering anxiety, depression. We are spiritually devastated. We are spiritually suffering, and this is violence every single day that is enacted upon our communities, our lives. Systemic violence every aspect of my life and the life of the people I love. White allies must ask themselves, what are some of the immediate ways I can help? What are some of the long-term ways I can help? What are some ways I can use my privilege and access and resources to center and support marginalized women, men, and children? How can I hold myself and other white people accountable while we think through strategic ways to work toward liberation? And how can I do this work without placing the burden on people of color? For Catholics, this can mean thinking more deeply about the resources and groups created at our respective parish groups, on Catholic campuses, in Catholic book clubs. This means asking what relationships our physical churches, parishes, media spaces, and religious leaders have to oppressive systems and practices. This means creating and imagining new ways to be Catholic allies, whether it is raising funds to bail out an organizer, or whether it's raising funds for an organizer who needs their rent supported. Many of the work that is being done in these movements and these spaces is being done by Black and brown, queer and trans women who are always at the forefront of these movements and often do this work unpaid. This can also mean imagining and dreaming of a Catholic allyship that has not been dreamed of before. The Black Lives Matter movement helped countless begin to understand what it means to organize. It jump-started the conscientiousness awakening for many in my generation. It helped me to begin to ask questions I had never asked before of myself or my church. In recent years, we have seen criticisms of this movement emerge, including criticisms from the families of survivors of those killed by armed white violence and Black journalists who have attempted to call out the movement for transparency around how funds allocated to the movement have been used. This is an important critique, especially because it is coming from Black Americans who have followed and engaged with the movement in a variety of ways. However, the criticism I often hear from white Catholics in our church is not aimed at helping the movement be accountable to the community it claims to serve. Rather, it is aimed at disparaging a movement authentically centered around Blackness and a rejection of whiteness, from its Black queer founders to the grassroots trans organizers that empowered the movement in Ferguson, to the Black journalists who have reported and analyzed the movement's birth. This is an important distinction because we cannot lump criticisms from the Black community with racist comments from white Catholics, including our bishops and priests. We need to understand the movement and how it has inspired and galvanized thousands, while also learning from the thinkers who are actively forcing this movement to learn new ways of holding itself accountable. We must understand the role this movement plays in the histories of liberation in the United States. And we must also name and understand the following. The Catholic Church, especially our male leaders, are threatened by social movements led by Black queer women. As Davis, Dent, Miners, and Ritchie write in Abolition Feminism, abolition will not end all harm or interpersonal violence. We must do the work to both prevent and reduce harm while we practice and grow transformative ways to respond when harm does happen. Abolition feminism is this intentional investment of our resources to support a flourishing of our collective best selves while reclaiming accountability from the carceral regime. How can abolition help Catholics to think more deeply about our faith? How can it help us to think more deeply about questions of justice and reconciliation? How can it help us to think about how to fight for and create a world where all of creation can flourish? What does it mean to critique not just oppressive systems, but the power and privileges white bodies are allowed to hold in America, in our church, in our media? I encourage you to read, along with Abolition Feminism, Derricka Purnell's book, Becoming Abolitionist, Police, Protest, and the Pursuit of Freedom. I also encourage you to read Assata Shakur's autobiography. It was recommended to me by a friend earlier this year, and it has been crucial for my thinking this year because it is a direct account of one woman's journey as a Black activist. Both these texts have helped me to ask myself many of the questions and ideas that I have shared with you today. Both invited me to think more deeply about what it means to theorize and fight for Christ-centered liberation, but also how to practically begin to apply an abolitionist framework to my daily life, including how I relate to and build with my Bronx community. Last, I also invite you to think about the role of art in this journey. Art is really important for me because I am someone who is on her mental health journey, and doing this work can be very, very draining, and art grounds me and allows me to hope even when hope feels really difficult. And my last parting words that I would like to leave you all with are from Nayyirah Waheed Salt. Decolonization requires acknowledging that your needs and desires should never come at the expense of another's life energy. It is being honest that you have been spoiled by a machine that is not feeding you freedom, but feeding you the milk of pain. Thank you all for listening today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.